Okay, Mr. Jake Carter. This has probably been the episode that has taken the longest to confirm and schedule in. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. I shouldn't be pleased to have that title, but I'm glad I've got one anyway, So that's I'm cool with that.
No, it's good. As we said off
Yeah.
air, it's given us another almost year to have content to discuss.
Exactly.
It works out well.
Yeah.
So
and
Jake,
everything happens for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. I think maybe some of the stuff that you said off air is worth reiterating in today's conversation around how this year's gone for you, because obviously there's so much attention on sort of the negative side of things, but actually it's, I think, great to hear people who have had a positive year and potentially what we can learn from those individuals as well. But Jake, before we dive into whatever we're going to dive into today, for those people that aren't aware of you or your work, do you want to give us a little introduction?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jake. I basically teach on functional medicine. Now, functional medicine is rather an ambiguous term. Basically, what that tries to do is it tries to marry both conventional advances with Eastern and traditional philosophies. And it looks upstream to find the root cause of the dysfunction rather than viewing the symptom through the lens of the keyhole. So it takes into appreciation that interdependency and synergy, what we have as the human experience. And it really takes into account all things within and without of the human body. So when I'm of that philosophy and of that kind of viewpoint, to really work with the human body, we can't specialize on a certain aspect or factor. So a good example of this, if someone has gut health issues and they can't really get any redemption whatsoever, and they go to see a specialist, and they go to see a gastroenterologist, and they're just looking at the gut. But really, they're having these gut health issues because they're suffering from PTSD. So really, if you keep looking at the symptom, you're not going to find anything about PTSD. But then when you ask deeper down, you look into possibly transgenerational trauma, intrauterine trauma, interrupted bonds, and all these other aspects there, you can have that light bulb moment and realize, aha, this person's stuck in flight and fight mode and not really going into rest and digest mode. So we should probably do some things to reprogram, reformat, and release those traumas to allow the gut health to get better. So that's, in a nutshell, what functional medicine does and the philosophies of that. And there's many different ways to kind of communicate and work with this. So that being said, when working with the human body, you have to take all things into account, which has enabled me to be on this beautiful path of learning what health is and what the human experience is, and try to learn as much about that as possible. So it's enabled me to acquire 20 different seminars now. I travel and teach. I've taught in 9 different countries. I've got clients in 29, and last year I did 54 flights. So it's a beautiful way to not only see the world, but help people on their healing journeys, whatever that may mean to them.
Brilliant. And how have you kind of got to where you are today, Jake? What's that journey look like for you?
Yep, so it's actually reiterating a quote what we said previous to the recording, start of the recording, and that's opportunity often comes misguided as misfortune. And it's a valuable quote. Probably it isn't the most fun to say, and it's not the sexiest, but it's the one which is probably of the highest value, because my journey started, technically my journey started from being a little maverick in school selling out-of-date chocolate. So, I've kind of had that kind of self-employed mentality from the age of 14 or so. But it really started from 15 years of age, really. And I started training, I guess as an escapism, you could probably look at it. But I started training. I wasn't any good at school. I was terrible at school. I hated it. And I just started training. I was doing well in the gym, and so the gym owner approached me and says, "Look, Jake, you know your stuff. Do you want to work here, cash in hand?" And they're paying me £3.64 an hour. But back to me back then, I was like, get in, because I'm doing my passion and I'm getting paid for it, and that's what most people don't get a chance to do in this day and age. But I was fortunate that things aligned and enabled that opportunity. And then from working in this gym, then someone at college who was a lecturer said, Jake, you stuff, you ever thought about being a PT? So I was like, yeah, that's pretty cool. We could probably skip out level 2, could go straight to level 3, and then you'd be done in a year. That's good. And then I remember at college, one of the lecturers in the interviews, he was saying how I'm really going to be struggling, and I'm going to have to do a lot of catching up. And I was just thinking, now this guy doesn't know how much that I want to do personal training. He's clueless. I'm going to prove him wrong. And I did. I smashed it. And then just at the age of 15, 10, and 16 or so, I basically got a job before I finished my college degree as a personal trainer, self-employed. So it's almost like one moves into the next. It's ever so flowing. And I started as a personal trainer. I was 16 years old, 9 stone wet through, probably 5 foot nothing, right? And I couldn't really represent the product of what I was trying to deliver, because I'm just this scrawny, small guy. And that's how I perceived myself then, because the insecurities, hence why I started training. And I was just training harder and harder and harder, because I was working amongst a team of these bodybuilders, these big people. And that's how the immature mind works. It bases value on aesthetics and superficial level, kind of materialistic stuff. But I was training to try and get as muscly as I could, as lean as I could, to really represent the product of what I was trying to deliver and portray. And that's when I got injured. And this is where the journey starts, because I had a bulge disc in L3, 4, L4, 5. And this is anywhere between the age, I think it was maybe the age of like 17, or maybe 17, somewhere around there. I had a bulge disc in L3, 4, and L4, 5. And I couldn't train. So now everything what my life was evolved around, the only thing what I was good at was taken away from me. And I'm self-employed, I'm young, and I couldn't really represent the product. So this is when I thought, well, what can I control? What can I use and develop my expertise as, and my skill as, so I can still do well whilst being self-employed? And that was nutrition. And I really tried to read books, but I suffer from a very slight form of dyslexia. And so just reading's a struggle sometimes. But I listened to plenty of podcasts, things on YouTube, and then saved up my money time after time, and I continuously reinvested back into education. And that enabled me to get to the point where I recovered from my injury. I learned more about the impacts of poor gut health, because I was doing a lot of partying back then. My gut health wasn't the best. And stress, sleep, turmeric, ginger, vitamin D, you name it. Along with learning about things like, supporting the glutes for the lower back health and the rest. And that was a very empowering moment, because it showed me the true capabilities of nutrition and how I could redeem myself from this debilitating injury. But I didn't learn my lesson, because shortly after that, a year or two, I then had a slap tear in my shoulder, and that was a nasty injury, which then brought me back to square one. It's like, training isn't really working for you. Go back to nutrition. So then I become more fascinated with nutrition. And the really interesting thing here is, at the time, I was playing around with all these different diets, and I was doing like a paleo, intermittent fasting, ketogenic diet. But when you look at my DNA, I know I said I wouldn't go too sciencey, but when you look at my DNA, I've got like an APOE4 polymorphism, and my metabolism of fats is quite poor, so it resonates with the DNA. And when you look at the kind of physiological biofeedback symptoms of poor fat metabolism, I was presenting with a whole array of these different symptoms. So jaundice looking eyes, yellow eyes, pain on the right side of the ribcage, waking up at 3 a.m. And interestingly, I didn't know this at the time, but my meridian line for my gallbladder was like screwing up, my liver, gallbladder kind of functioning from the high fat diet. It just wasn't really up to scratch, because my production of bile wasn't quite there. So when you're looking at this meridian line going through the right shoulder blade, I had all these pains and knots and adhesions. And it was, I would probably attribute this down to having a high fat diet, which I wasn't really working effectively with, because I was doing this ketogenic diet. We're talking not short term, we're talking over 6 months, okay? And I wasn't supporting it with any choleritic or cholesterol-based foods, and no bitter foods there to support the production or release of bile, which would have helped me digest and assimilate the fats. So I had all these knots through this meridian line, and it led to the shoulder blade not really sitting still, because the shoulder blade is like a nib in the paper, and you have a compass, okay, with the nib in the paper, and you draw a nice circle. That's the shoulder blade there, the nib, and then the pencil that you have in there, what you're drawing that nice circle with, is the shoulder. But when you have all these muscle knots and adhesions around the muscles surrounding the shoulder blade, like the rhomboids, the trapezius, and all the rest, it doesn't work well. And then you get a lot of impingement in the shoulder, and that impingement then led to issues, inflammation, and a slap tap. So that was, again, a realigning process. And if I would have known the information, what I would have done just simply a year or two later down the line, I could have mitigated against that. But if I wouldn't have had that injury, I wouldn't have been brought back to nutrition. And throughout that process, because I was developing my skill set in nutrition and other factors too, like psychology, I started to do a lot of one-to-ones, become a team leader. I started teaching nationally at the age of 18. And I started teaching internationally, throughout Europe at least, at the age of, I believe, 22 or 23. And then globally at the age of 25 or so, 25, yeah. So it was that stepping stone journey of having these injuries, which enabled me to have that understanding and that realignment into what I do now. So that's a long kind of story, but it explains it from the start to the finish of how opportunity can often come misguided as misfortune. I think that's an important thing to look at in this day and age, because with the struggles what everyone's facing, with the limitations, the lockdowns, we're so thinking about what we had and what may be coming, we forget to live in the present day.
Yeah, absolutely. And now you're based in Australia, right?
I'm based on Earth, so like there's no specific spot per se. I've been living in Australia for a year now. I'm going to be here until the places are warmer, and then I kind of go with the flow. I go where the seminars go, where I want to go, and we were supposed to be living in the Amazon forest right now, like learning from some shamans. But we couldn't travel, so we're in Western Australia. We're actually living in Melbourne, which obviously at the time of this recording is probably one of the most limiting places to live due to the lockdown and quarantine rules that they've kind of brought on that. But we had this foresight, this intuition. We're talking at least 2 months before any of the kind of chaos occurred, and I tried informing many people, many reputable individuals in the health industry and in the health and fitness industry about what was coming, and no one was really entertaining the idea, and no one wanted to stand up and speak about some of this information. Well, no one stood up and spoke about any of this information because they thought it would damage their brand and XYZ. But we managed to get out of Melbourne despite them closing the borders around 3 days before. But we tried phoning up the State Police of Victoria, the State Police of Western Australia, the Federal Police of Australia, the COVID helpline, and no one could explain anything nor grant us an exemption. So we just basically thought we'd sell everything in about 2 days, buy a plane ticket, and get out of there before the stuff comes what we suspected would be coming.
Interesting. So I guess to dive into certain topics today, I wonder whether we can just rewind. You mentioned a couple things that people I think will be really interested in, and it's certainly helpful information to know, which was around the ApoE4 gene. If you can just kind of expand on that and what the potential significance of that can be from a cognitive perspective and stuff like that. But also you touched on the concept of when you're on the ketogenic diet, having issues with fat metabolism and bile flow or production. So can you touch on just like examples of the bitter foods that, with your knowledge now, you would have been implementing back then? Because obviously a lot of our listeners are potentially struggling with chronic GI issues. Maybe they've had a diagnosis of SIBO and things. And as you know, Jake, bile is an antibacterial endogenous defense mechanism for things like SIBO. So it's such a critical part of that process. And I guess to some degree, they overlap in regards to ApoE4 and how we emulsify our fats and digest them. So that might be a nice way to kind of dive into some of the science and to pick your brain.
Sure. So going back to that moment, that time when I got injured, I also got my blood work done. And this is something I missed out there at the start. And my blood work, my bilirubin was 47. And my liver enzymes were elevated. They were 30 to 40s. Probably because I would have been training the day before, who knows. But nonetheless, when we look at this, that's important information. Bilirubin is a waste product. We could say it's a waste product. There's functions what it does, but we'll not get into that. But a breakdown of, let's just say, red blood cells. And we then use bile to bind onto this, conjugate, and eliminate it from our body. So evidently mine was too high. I don't know what score you prefer using, but I find less than 10 is good, but probably between 2 and 10 is good for the English scale there. And if you're looking in the Australian scale, it'd be something like 0.2 to 1. Okay. And on the Australian kind of scale is what we use there for bloods. So mine was evidently 4 times higher than what it should have been, which shows my body's ability to bind onto this effectively and eliminate it wasn't that good, which really indicates bile also probably wasn't really working how it should have been. And I find that really interesting because all of this occurred at the time when I didn't know what any of this meant. But now looking back and reflecting, we can see how traditional Chinese medicine, with waking up at around 3 a.m. every morning, which correlates with the liver and the organ clock, was flagging up there. The meridian line was giving me a little bit of a jibber jabber, and my DNA was also indicating the potential issue with digesting saturated fats. And then my bloods, which also indicated this. So you can see that crossover from the different modalities of how TCM was trying to tell me, blood work was trying to tell me, DNA was trying to tell me. And then just reading the human body through the signs and symptoms, what my body was giving off was also trying to tell me. And I found it really interesting how there's this kind of harmonious flow of communication, but my ability to understand this wasn't quite there. And that's why I got injured. And if I would have been able to read it, I wouldn't have got injured. I truly believe that. So going back to your question with ApoE4 polymorphism, we have to remember that genes load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. So just because we have a certain gene, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's being expressed. But in this case, there's a high probability it was. Now, looking at ApoE4, well, this reduces our ability to digest fats that were particularly saturated fats. And this can have a knock-on effect to other functions within our body, because if we have a reduced ability to digest and assimilate fats, then when we look at the benefits of fats, we can see, well, that's very broad, because we have things like our brain health, which you mentioned about cognition. Well, 60% of the brain is made up of fats there. So if we have a reduced ability to assimilate fats effectively, therefore the brain health is going to be something which is potentially challenged. And this is why there is some correlation with ApoE4 and the risk of Alzheimer's. We can look into, going back to the issues with breaking down fats and issues with bile. We can see that when people don't really digest fats that well, or they don't produce bile that well, or they've had the gallbladder removed, which potentiates the bile around 3 to 5-fold, they may have issues producing hormones, because the fats broken down into cholesterol turns through to pregnenolone and goes through the pathway to produce the hormones there. We can also see issues with other functions too, such as the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, K. We can also see some kind of cellular disruption long-term when someone has these issues and they've been avoiding them or overlooking them, because the bilipid membrane of the cells is made up of 95% of fat. And then we can even look further if we want to get into the technical parts. There's the FXR pathway of the liver, where bile actually stimulates its own healing and regeneration. And you can even look into the conversion of T4 through to T3 through the TGR5 receptors, which bile can also stimulate. So we can really see that there's a broad range of benefits to bile, which would be represented possibly from poor fat digestion. But it's not just limited to bile. There could be issues with lipase and other factors there too. But for someone which is having these issues with the ability to digest fats, or simply if they're on a high fat diet, they would also want to support the digestion of fats. It's smart to include some bitter foods, and these bitter foods are brilliant for the liver health, but the stimulation of bile and the release of bile from the gallbladder. So these would be things such as rocket, which is amazing for its nitrates and supports the mitochondria. It actually has more nitrates than beetroot, I believe. Chicory, which I believe has 3 names from working with clients globally. You have endive, which is largely called in the States. You have witloof, which is called in Belgium and Australia. And then you have chicory, which is what we call it in the UK, which has been a nightmare learning because I'd recommend something and then they're like, I can't find it anywhere. I'm like, I'm pretty sure you're going to have it. And then eventually I had to learn these different names. So chicory is good. Rosemary is good. Those two go well together. You get chicory, cut it in half. You could use some olive oil if you want to use olive oil. If you're worried about it cooking with it, there's other oils that you could use. And then put some rosemary and put it in the oven. Do that on probably like 160 degrees centigrade or so for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It's going to be quite nice. Radish is another good one. So radish is phenomenal for bile. Then you also have things like the dandelion tea, for instance, and artichoke, which is amazing, so good. You know? And these are all amazing foods which can really stimulate the production or flow of bile, which will help people digest some of the fats. But not just limited to this. You know, I often see this overlooked when people have PMS or endometriosis or kind of like estrogen dominant related symptoms. And when we look at one of the pathways, what we eliminate estrogen, glucuronidation. And if this is impaired, we can't really pass estrogen through our stool and other pathways and eliminate it from our body effectively. It can therefore lead to the estrogen being reabsorbed into the body through the enterohepatic recirculation process. So when people have symptoms of like PMS or high estrogen, I also think it is smart as well just to support that bile stimulation, so they can have that conjugation onto those toxins and hormones, youth hormones, and that effectively support the elimination from the body.
Awesome. So yeah, it's interesting what you talk about, excuse me, with the bile and having more roles to play than what we may have initially thought. I was doing a little bit of research around this recently, actually, from sort of a gallbladder removal perspective. With, for example, the greater risk of developing metabolic diseases once it's removed, which is just, again, fascinating. It goes back to what you said at the very beginning around just the interconnectedness of the body and how we can't think of one organ, one gland, one pathway as some sort of isolated thing that has one responsibility to play. I guess a question that's coming to mind that might be for some of our listeners is, it's great to know certain things we can consider to support bile production or bile flow with these kind of cholagogue and choleretic compounds in certain foods, but what might be impacting it in the first place?
Yeah, really good question. So there's an array of factors really here. So sometimes you may not have the nutrients required to produce bile. So this is often seen with people with low cholesterol, for instance, because cholesterol is a component of producing bile. We also have things like taurine, choline, electrolytes there, lipids, which kind of all get bound together. And that's what we use to really aid with that production. So if someone is low from certain factors, could be medication, it could be certain DNA kind of SNPs which prevent that assimilation of those nutrients or certain functions in the body. But then that's certainly a factor. There's things such as gallstones, which is another one. You got liver flukes. You got issues with the liver itself, so high inflammation, high toxicity. Then you have things which from an esoteric, holistic perspective, can influence the liver, and that's things like anger and the emotions correlating there for the liver and the gallbladder, which is, I mean, we might as well get onto this actually at this point here. But you look at the emotions, and the emotions can really impact certain organs. And it's some phenomenal work what I've been doing recently, which is just reframing the initial template and that defining moment of these kind of emotions, and allowing the subconscious mind to release it, so it's not stuck in that subconscious interpretive software at the back of the person's mind, changing their perception of reality and their perception of identity. We can do some kind of psychological work to release such emotions, and in which we can get redemption of health. Because I actually picked up an individual, and she developed autoimmune hepatitis at the age of 25, and there was no justifiable reason why she got this. You know, she was perfectly healthy, and boom. So when I asked her about her childhood, I was like, right, okay, so let's look at your childhood here. And she wasn't able to pull back any memories. So then I said, right, well, can you remember your house? No, she couldn't remember the house. I said, right, let's design a house. Let's make up any house. It doesn't have to be the house that you grew up in, but let's just try to make it resemble that. So we started describing a house, where the rooms were, how many rooms, what the garden was like. Was the carpets in certain rooms? Was the marble in others? Was it leather sofa? And we really built this visual reconstruction of her home. And then we picked a room and was like, right, let's try to see if any memories come back now. You're in this room, you've got the carpet floor, you've got the white walls, you're in the bedroom. Do any memories come back here? And then she was able to pull back these memories. And from that, she was able to pull back 7 different memories of early life physical abuse. And after discussing those memories, it just opened up a flood of emotions. And then I went through the emotions which correlated to the liver and the gallbladder. And she was experiencing anger, frustration, incapable to take action, withholding of all feelings, complaining, felt incapable of changing, self-sabotage, discontented, toxic, and incapable of standing up for herself. Well, all of those emotions, that's bingo, that's full house. All of those are just for the liver. And then when we went on to the gallbladder, she was experiencing resentment, victimhood, incapable to decide, blaming, self-pity, feeling second best, unforgiving, and bitter. So that was all but feeling sacrifice, manipulated, and false pride. So she almost had all the emotions come back to the gallbladder. So when we look at that, we can see that the emotions can have this energetic response on certain organs too, because at the end of the day, we are vibrational beings, you know, and we can break it down to light, you know, light is a vibration anyway. So then we can look at like the Rife machine or things like this, which is a vibrational frequency, which apparently, quote unquote, was used to treat certain diseases such as cancers, and it is done through vibration. So we can look at that, and we can look in traditional Chinese medicine and see, well, certain emotions can correlate to certain organs. And then we can look into modern day technology and see how when we experience different emotions, we have different heat emitted in different areas, and we have different vibrations and different scans. So it was really interesting to see this information and gain some kind of validity into, or at least understanding and possibilities, let's say, into why she developed autoimmune hepatitis at the age of 25. But those are things which, again, could create issues with bile production, you know, because they will impact the liver, and the liver produces bile, and the gallbladder is what holds it and potentiates it around 3 to 5-fold. There could also be things such as SIBO, dysbiosis, stress. So there's a whole host of different things. Medications is another. So yeah, it's interesting to say the least.
Yeah, I think the idea of organs holding or being the center of certain emotions, that really does fascinate me. And I always remember a colleague of mine who does a lot of sort of detox work within her programs and within the sort of client that she generally supports. And I always remember her first telling me how she finds that a lot of her clients during that detox process experience these kind of just uprisings of anger. as part of just this sort of detoxification. It's like they're actually
Yeah.
purging some of this stored emotion as well.
Yeah, and you look at alcoholics as well. So the symptoms of a stereotypical alcoholic, and you could say, okay, well, that's the alcohol, that's the toxins there. But you can also look into the feelings of anger, frustration, incapable to take action, withholding feelings, complaining, incapable of changing, self-sabotage, toxic, discontented, and incapable of standing up for oneself. A lot of those fit the stereotypical alcoholic, and that's why they drink. But is it a bi-directional communication here from the drinking, which is damaging the liver, which is exhibiting these emotions, which is therefore making them want to have more alcohol to try and drown those emotions? But is it only making it worse? Who knows?
Yeah, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, I love these weird things, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it just reminds me of some of Gabor Mate's work, for example, where he talks about the one thing that I always remember from his book, When the Body Says No, is if you look at smokers, the risk of developing lung cancer is less to do with the smoking, apparently, and more to do with the emotional expression of those smokers and whether actually they're able to or not. So a smoker who also is emotionally suppressed or is repressing their emotions and isn't able to express themselves seems to be at greater risk of lung cancer than a smoker who is able to express themselves healthily.
Interesting, because when you look at the emotions for the lungs, chronic grief, sadness, longing for, feeling trapped, isolated, not belonging, despair, disappointed, lost zest for life, hopelessness, and unhealed separation. Again, this is just extrapolating this and putting a pretend scenario. But when you crave a cigarette is when you have certain stressful situations, and when you maybe trying to cope with certain kind of factors, or feeling trapped in the work office, you need to get outside, not belonging, you want to get outside, or things like this. You know, who knows? There's interesting associations there.
Yeah, definitely. So with all that in mind, Jake, I'm wondering whether there are any sort of case studies or examples that you're able to share with us to give us kind of insight almost into how you work and how your brain works, and I guess how that differs to maybe a slightly more traditional functional medicine perspective. There's certainly been an evolution of functional medicine. I think we're all able to say that at the beginning it was very much a kind of test treat scenario kind of going on, but now some of these other modalities and some of these other therapies are definitely being intertwined with the traditional functional medicine model, as it were. So I would love just to hear you, I guess, talk a little bit more about all of this interconnectedness, and how you approach either a certain condition, while appreciating that we're always really focusing on the individual rather than the condition anyway.
Okay. So to put things into perspective, like I've developed and refined this screening form what I've made and over the past 10 years, and it takes into account there's different sections within it. I think there's over 20, but it looks into things such as intrauterine trauma, interrupted bonds, infancy trauma, childhood trauma, adulthood trauma. It looks into the gut health in terms of HCl function, bile function, colon, small intestines, constipation. It looks into the dental hygiene. It looks into the kidneys, the liver, the heavy metal toxicity, blood sugar, hypercortisolism and hypocortisolism. So the high levels of blood levels of cortisol and low levels. So basically high levels of stress, low levels of stress. Low levels of stress being a arguably adaptive response for stress, which is just chronic and long term. Thyroid being low, thyroid being high, estrogen being low, estrogen being high, testosterone being low, testosterone being high, progesterone being low, progesterone being high, and there's also a section on visual biofeedback markers. So there's 64 different things we can look at the human body to assess and give insight into nutrient deficiencies, dysfunctions, toxicity, and imbalances. And I think they're the main ones, really. And I basically, when I initially get a client, that's such a bad way to say it. When I initially analyze a client, I like to take everything into account and leave no stone unturned, because quite often we get into the habit of thinking we know what the issue is. And we certainly may well know what the issue is, but there may be secondary factors or even later factors which come into play, which you could also possibly prevent or address or heal on that journey. So I like to look into every single symptom and get all the possibilities out of why that symptom could be there on the table. And then once I get all those symptoms and all those possibilities, I like to connect the dots. And that's generally how I do it. And I connect the dots with the how could this make this, then how could this, and then I see if it fits the timeline of when those things come about. And that's how I take this 360-degree level of healing kind of approach for the individual, and looking from all things within and without. And with also in that screening form, we look into paradigms, relationships, and other factors such as this. But an example of a case study, this is a short and sweet one, really. My partner's friend come around, and instantly when I saw him, I noticed that his nails curved over. And then I'm a bit weird like this. Like as soon as I see someone, I just instantly look and try to find as many things as I can in the first 5 seconds. and I saw that his nails were curving over. And in TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, this can correlate to the lungs. Okay. So then I thought, oh, this is interesting. And then I asked him, oh, do you wake up between the hours of 3 and 5 a.m.? And he wakes up every night at 4:30 a.m. in the morning. Not to get up ready for work, he just wakes up. Oh, okay, that's pretty cool. And so if you don't mind me asking, out of the emotions, how many do you currently experience? And I went through the emotions of the lung, what I just described earlier. He was experiencing 80% of them. And I just goes, oh, well, it's interesting to see that, because all of this correlates back to the lungs. And it just so happened the night before, he actually went to the doctors to have an x-ray in his lungs because he had issues getting sleep at night from respiratory distress, and he wasn't able to breathe that effectively. So it's really interesting how you can see, you look at the nails, and that correlates to when he wakes up, and that correlates to the emotions. But then that's what he's doing in the conventional realm. So yeah, that's a short and sweet one, but that kind of puts more proof in the pudding and validity there on the that interdimensional response what we have as this human experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's an amazing one, in fact. Sorry to interrupt. It just came to my mind. Yeah, an individual came to me at the age of 35, diagnosed with early menopause, and I was asking her about her childhood. And at the age of 2, a biological dad left. At the age of 16, she rekindled that relationship. At the age of 23, he left again. Her stepfather also cheated on her mother. So from her perspective, there was a lack of a masculine role within the family unit. So she superseded with her masculinity to basically overcompensate due to that void. And that suppressed her femininity. So therefore, she was really exhibiting these masculine energy in her lifestyle. She was very facts, figures, objective, assertive, deadlines, running 2 businesses. But then you look into that feminine energy and the characteristics there, and she wasn't really doing many of the factors which would associate towards the feminine energy. So the first thing what I asked her to do was to go to an area of significance and write a letter of forgiveness, because I always say resentment is the poison and forgiveness is the cure. So she went to an area of significance, which is a safe healing space where she can create herself. It could be in her house where she doesn't work, she doesn't eat, she doesn't sleep. This is just where she does meditation, gratitude logs, expressive writing, you name it. But preferably in this case, I asked her to go to an area of significance which resembled a memory significant of her father. And after she was there, do some breath work, do some grounding, some aromatherapy, whatever you need to do to center and align yourself. I asked her to write a letter of forgiveness. Now, this letter of forgiveness can still hold boundaries, because that's an important thing. Because most people, when they think about forgiveness, they think it is the dissolvement of boundaries, and that's not it. It's forgiveness, such as not holding on to resentment. So I told her, this would be really valuable for you to do, and it's going to help release these subconscious patterns of behavior and thoughts from how you view the world and how you view yourself. And then after you've done that, I'd like you to start painting or drawing each night. And the painting and drawing is right brain dominant, and the right side of the brain is creative, it's colourful, it's lucid, whereas the left side is objective, hard, facts, numbers. So by stimulating that right hemisphere of the brain, it stimulates the left side of the body. The left side of the body is the feminine side. 10 days after I told her to do this, she got a normal period back. So that's just one simple example of how we can look into the emotions and the spiritual energetics. Another example is an individual who didn't have her menstrual cycle for, I think it was between 9 months and 12 months. And I analysed the stuff there, and she had a deficiency in her root chakra. So she had to start wearing more of the colour red. And she also had some traumas which kind of stops this process from occurring. And I was asking her to do expressive writing. And expressive writing is simply what you sit down, you write about these traumas, and you do that again in a safe, healing space where you create yourself. And you don't have to worry about punctuation, grammar, spelling. You just write down whatever comes to mind, and you have to do it for 20 minutes without any distractions, without looking at your phone. She put this off for a month to a month and a half, but as soon as she did it, she had a period back the next day.
Wow.
So there's many kind of stories like this, really interesting ones. You could even look into someone who had long-standing gut health issues, and she's in her 60s, late 60s, beautiful lady, and her gut health got so bad that she had a Giardia infection, and she was prescribed 10 different antibiotics all at the same time to combat this infection. And 2 of which she had to pick up from the HIV and AIDS clinic, because they would only dose it in a 2-week fashion. They'd only prescribe it from this clinic because they're that strong. And her gut health never improved. But then after analysing her childhood, she actually went to boarding school. Let me put the notes here. There we go. She went to boarding school at the age of 8. And from going to boarding school, she acquired these emotions, these thoughts, these feelings of loneliness, abandonment, feeling lost, neglected, deprived of love, safety, closeness, intimacy, nourishment, warmth, and felt unable to receive. In which she never actually did some inner work to release these. She never went through the pain to enable it to be released. Instead, she just got over it. But when someone gets over something, it's another way of burying it in the body. That's just the same analogies. You get over something or you bury it underneath. It's the same kind of thing at the end of the day. And she was currently feeling the loneliness, the deprived of love, safety, closeness, intimacy, nourishment, and warmth. And after looking at this, we thought, well, okay, so let's try and create this environment for you where you feel those feelings, with family and loved ones around you. So when she went over to see her daughter, she was living in Cairo, she went over to Lebanon, the feelings just dissipated, and her gut health was amazing, even though the diet wasn't as vigilant. And as soon as she returned to Cairo, where she felt all these feelings come flooding back in, where she wasn't in that environment, her gut health symptoms would come back. So in this case, we weren't able to cultivate the environment to induce those emotions. Instead, I asked her to write a story, a made-up story of an individual which would feel those emotions. So to make up a story of someone where they have a strong network around them where they feel this love, safety, closeness, intimacy. And 20 minutes each day, when you write this story, you're submerged into this with the highest detail, almost as if your senses are theirs. And when she did that, the emotions went away and her gut health got better.
Amazing.
So yeah, so this is the weird stuff what I like doing these days.
Yeah, and I was going to say, you know, I appreciate each case is a unique case, but do you see any trends with your clients? Are there some things that come up more than others? And based on what you've been sharing here, would you agree that a lot of stuff can come from either childhood, from trauma, from emotional suppression, and from that area of our experience?
Yeah. I see over 95% of clients have oppressed emotions, which are really modeling how they think about reality or themselves. And in some way, shape, or form, that is being a dysfunction on their life, you know, in terms of either their health or their happiness.
Yeah, and I think from what I've experienced, from what I've seen, from what I've read, the irony is that we're often looking to validate some of those underlying beliefs that might not be serving us. So there are behaviors that we have maybe from childhood that served us at that point in time, but those behaviors have essentially become maladaptive where we are today. So there's that, I guess, again, that sort of childhood trauma, or that inability to, in some ways, evolve and to understand the blocks from a behavioral perspective, because it's very easy, I think, to go down the physical route and think that we've got to the root cause of something by saying that your bacterial overgrowth is causing your bloating or something, but there's always another step. And for me, I think it's often, there's a big behavioral element to it, and there's obviously the saying we're spiritual beings having a human experience, but we're equally emotional beings having a human experience. And those behaviors are being driven by those emotions ultimately.
So let's just say I did some plant medicine last night, and I turned around to my partner and I said, emotions are the language of life. And I was describing it as an artist has a palette of paint, and he requires a diverse range of different colors so he can paint this beautiful picture. And he needs the different shades there. He needs the different colors to give it the depth and the detail. And without those shades, without the darker colors there, the darker emotions, we don't have this vibrance of life, because we don't have that duality, and we don't have that experience where we can cultivate and define the meaning. And we become very monotone, monologue, if we weren't to experience such things. So, you know, it's really interesting, because most people view these traumas in a negative light, in which, you know, there is going to be a large amount of negativity from that. But I think what is a very empowering shift is learning that certain memories can give hope and benefit and beauty to other things in life later to come from a certain experience. And that may sound very insensitive to many people which have experienced some traumas, but having worked with many, I do think, going back to the start, like I said, you know, like the reframing of a situation is imperative, and how one views that can be either a poison or a cure.
Yeah, you know, I guess it's this concept of post-traumatic growth that's becoming more sort of well known and discussed, which I think is just, again, as you say, it's a way to reframe it and a way to move forwards in the right direction ultimately as a response to that experience. And that's a process, obviously.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So I have a question, if you're open to exploring it with what you've just mentioned there, which is, I guess, it may be a big question, but it's around sort of how you feel your use of plant medicine has helped you evolve as a human.
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, so I love it when I get to speak about this stuff. So first of all, first and foremost, people use plant medicine wrong. You know, they do it as an escapism, and they do it as a high. They do it because they are doing it from a novelty aspect, almost recreationally, rather than appreciating the true power of which it has. So that's first and foremost. So if anyone was to do any plant medicine, it's very important that they did it in the right settings with the right people to support and guide them and make sure that they have a sacred space and they clear and the grounds of any negative energies and are equipped to support and heal you on that journey. And going back to speaking more about this in detail now, it's what I attribute my ability to learn and retain information to the highest. So I learn things which haven't been proven or tested yet. And that was pretty cool how that just popped then. That was just a random water bottle which just this made a weird noise then, and no one's in there. Okay, so I learned things which hasn't necessarily been proved yet in PubMed, the National Library of Medicine, or anything like this. And then you'll find like 2 weeks later that there's research papers coming out on it, which is really, really interesting. Now, there's things what I've not researched myself, such as analysing the swallowing mechanisms to assess the likelihood of someone developing Alzheimer's, for instance, and different things like this, which I have these kind of downloads and learnings from, which then end up having a lot of validity to. And when we look into this, you know, people can have different experiences with plant medicine. It can connect people in different ways. Some people can become more adept at intuition. Some people can connect more to their empathetic side, and some people can develop skills such as remote viewing or photo reading, or develop their healing with their hands, such as Reiki and things like this. So I find it really, really interesting. But it's certainly been something which has revolutionized how I do things in terms of how I think, how I live on this earth, and my other kind of views around that. And it's probably been the most important thing on my journey, which has enabled me to have these leaps and bounds, enabling me to dissolve the fixed fears, limiting beliefs, phobias, insecurities, and override the body dysmorphia and really overcome fears and view things in a different way to what most people wouldn't. So it's been a beautiful, beautiful, long experience. I've been using plant medicine for over 14 years now. And yeah, it's something which I highly value and respect.
Amazing. And you've actually at least semi-answered the second question that I've been itching to ask you all conversation, which was around learning, because you have a wealth of knowledge at the tip of your tongue, it seems. And I was just curious if you've sort of learned specific techniques in regards to supporting memory and sort of memory recall, or if that's, as you say, kind of just naturally of plant medicine as well.
So I was terrible at school. I was awful. In fact, in primary school, I had to sit on the worst table for, I think it was maths. Okay, you'd have like tables back in the day. You probably don't do this now. But there's a table where people which were the worst you'd sit on, right? And that wasn't from an attitude or anything like this. It was just a lack of knowledge and capability to do any good. And then from that, at school, I was pretty not so good, to say the least, and I do find that it has certainly helped with my memory. But I retrieve things differently as well. So throughout this podcast, you probably noticed that I look somewhat different when I recall. And to me, I look up to the right, and I have this little recall box. I can't see the box, but I know the box is there. Okay. And whenever I look into this box, I know that I'm going to get the answer what I need. And this could simply be a kind of learned behavioral mechanism, which is being consolidated from trust and faith in this, which may not even be associated to the plant medicine in itself. But simply by whenever I have to recall something of certain context, I just look into this box, and then I know I can pull it down and give what I require for that answer. So that's something, but I don't know if that's related to that. Another aspect to this as well is that I trust that all the information is out there, what we could ever possibly need, and everyone has access to this. It's just their awareness of gaining access to this. So I have that element of trust, and I think that's a huge thing, which helps me, and not just in learning, but in my career choices. Trust in myself, trust that I will make the right thing, trust that things will always be okay. And some people may say that is an element of possible naivety, but I'm trusting my gut instincts, as some people would refer it to. Not that they originate from the gut, I'd say it's some kind of instinct coming from back here, from behind my head somewhere. Not necessarily my gut. I feel it here, like above the crown chakra sort of thing. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. That's where I think, and that's where I get my information from.
So one of the things I'm trying to do at the moment is kind of trust my gut more, and learn what's the sensory feedback of that. So there have been a handful of decisions I've made in my life where I've been 100% sure it was the right thing to do. And there was a definite felt sense with that of kind of solidarity, of denseness. And it was like, I know I can feel that this is the right time, the right decision, the right choice, etc.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to tap into that as much as I can with kind of current decisions and things.
So one thing what you can do, okay, you can have your arms resting on your legs, okay, your knuckles and your forearms rest on your legs, and you sit relaxed and head chest up, and you close your eyes, and then you think of the question what you want to ask yourself, and take note of what direction your body twists, because one side will twist and that will represent a no, and the other side will represent a yes. Similar to how you can use a pendulum. So have you ever seen a pendulum crystal before? The pendulums, and you can use that as well, which it will spin, and one way will spin or swing, and that will represent a yes for you, and the other way will be a no. And you can use these pendulums, and they're pretty freaky, they're cool, but going back into this, we can only see 0.0034% of the visible light spectrum, or something around that, which really shows that the stuff around us we are barely even aware of. So there's so much more to this experience than what we can begin to associate to. Similar to when we look into things like the pyramids and how they line up with Orion's belt, and the coordinates are very similar to that of the speed of sound, and that the structure of the pyramids correlates to that in China and Mexico, and the same kind of structure there, and all this stuff what we don't know now but we did then.
Yes, that's something that really interests me. It's like the whole concept of ayahuasca and the 2 plants out of how many tens of thousands of different plants there must be in the Amazonian rainforest, and that real connection with nature. And I remember in a documentary that the shamans were saying that ultimately that the plants told them.
The singing to the shamans.
And I just think that element of things is, that's where we want to move back towards, ultimately, that connection that we once had. But one of the things that popped out to me there was the idea of sort of intuition, gut feeling, trusting yourself. I suspect I see a correlation of that in clients over the years, where there's almost a correlation between almost constantly doubting ourselves and seeking for
problems,
for one of the better word, validation, or seeking for solutions, answers to this person's nutrition, exercise, whatever it may be. And those that seem to just have a little bit more confidence in themselves and trusting their body. So, you know, even something as basic as food reactivity, and someone constantly seeking confirmation from outside of themselves about what they should be doing, compared to someone who is comfortable kind of listening to their body and sort of down regulating the white noise that is all there.
Yeah, and this comes back to the schooling system, right? Because when we look at the schooling system, the educational system, the conventional educational system, it teaches us to be very left brain dominant. It teaches us facts, figures, remember this, objectify that, and it disconnects us from the right side of the brain, which is intuitive and empathetic and to do with emotions and feelings. And it creates that disconnection from developing or even becoming aware of these feelings within us. So we can really see it's something which originates and starts very early in life, and therefore the longer we've been disconnected from it, the harder it is to reconnect.
Yeah, so true. I had some realizations around sort of schooling during a breathwork seminar that I attended recently. And it's a tricky one. I find at the moment that one of the challenges I have, I think, is sort of seeing both ends of the argument and trying to sort of fit in the middle sometimes. So what you were saying around sitting on a table in your maths class with all the other people who are bad at maths, you know, are we just reinforcing a belief around that, which is then just essentially very much going to follow us through for potentially the rest of our lives? And I know there's been a debate, I've even debated it with my parents around kind of competition in schools and sports days being banned in certain schools and things like this, because it's thought that competition is bad and it's developing poor self-esteem, etc. But again, sort of seeing both ends of the spectrum in regards to what is the belief being formed in a young boy or girl who is essentially being told they are not good at something and suddenly being ranked at a very young age based on that. And how does that impact us moving forwards? And I can't remember, there's definitely one study I've read around this where I think the researchers told the teachers of a new like cohort of students, the ones that showed to be more intelligent than others. And I think they did it for 2 different classes or something like this. But basically the thing that came out of the study was, if you tell a teacher that this student is one of the more intelligent within the class, that kind of has a ripple effect in regards to how the teacher communicates with that child and the trajectory of that child over the year. So if they told a teacher a lie, if they told a teacher that this student showed to be one of the more intelligent, but actually was one of the lowest in the way they examined them, it still played out from that perspective. So they still did better because the teacher had a belief that this child was more intelligent than they are. So I just think it's really interesting how those dynamics play out pretty much at like an unconscious level, obviously. But nonetheless, it gets me thinking about, you know, how I'm going to educate my future children from that perspective.
Yeah. And when we look into this, like, we do need that element of competition, because I've noticed, I think you did a podcast on, actually, when we look into the roles of masculinity, they're being dissolved. We can look into the handshake, and it's got weaker since 1985 for the males, but yet the females' handshakes got stronger. You can see that the US Army doesn't require a fitness test for enrollment now. We can look into things such as the sperm count dropping 57% since 1970. We can look at the sperm, the free testosterone levels dropping 45% in the past 15 years. You can look at all these different things, and it's like, well, masculinity is being challenged here. And there's this term which gets thrown around called toxic masculinity.
Mm.
And really, there's nothing masculine around that. It's immaturity, toxic immaturity, and it's due to a super compensatory pattern of behavior from early life feelings of inadequacy, probably from a lack of a masculine role within the family unit, or a lack of empathy from a masculine role in the family unit. Largely associates down to that. And we look at the roles of masculinity and traditional masculinity, and they are being dissolved, eroded as we speak from all these new age chemicals and new age censorship. So I do think competition is an element that is required, but I also completely agree with you that there will be this reciprocal effect from how their identity is formed at a young age and how malleable they are. And I guess it is really multifactorial on how the teacher communicates to them, how the parents communicate to them, how their friends are, and all these other things. It's interesting because if you look into the social network effect, there's an influence of friends. Okay, so for instance, I'm sure you would have heard of the Jim Rohn quote, "You're the average of the 5 people you spend your most time with." But studies have shown, this study was done over a 30-year span, a different study, over 12,000 individuals, and they found that there's an influence which extends to your friend's friend's friend, which can still influence you. So let's just say if your friend is obese, there's around a 60% chance that you're going to be obese. If your friend's friend is obese, you may not even ever meet your friend's friend, but there's a 25% chance or around that. And then your friend's friend's friend who is obese, there's an 11% chance that you're going to be obese. And you're most likely never going to meet your friend's friend's friend, but there's still that influence there. So going back to what you said in terms of how the individual communicates to them, I guess it's also passed on this energetic realm from this conscious field around us, and it isn't just limited to the teacher, but also the friends, what they make on that journey, probably on the same path, similar situation as them too.
Yeah, and I guess, I completely agree with that, and I think perhaps the biggest thing is the sort of the coping mechanisms or behaviors we have if we aren't innately good at something within childhood. And that's where parenting, teaching, support from friends, and I guess supporting that child understand and make a decision around what that means for them, which ultimately, I guess it's detaching identity from a typical success, whatever area of life that is ultimately. So I agree. I think competition is still an important element of this because it's a natural part of the world ultimately.
Yeah, and I guess it's competition on what context. That's another thing too, right? Because at the minute the competition is on stuff which may be largely irrelevant for the real life kind of situation and experience what we have. But if it was competition on empathy, right, and who could be the kindest to someone, well, that would really change the ball game there, wouldn't
it? Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Jake, I'm mindful of your time, so
we can keep going. I'm cool.
Is there anything that you would like to share with our listeners? Is there anything we haven't yet touched on that you would like to?
Honestly, I'm very easy speaking about whatever needs to be spoken about. There's all different realms, dimensions, information, topics, what we can discuss. And I think there are some interesting points what we could bring up there, which could be of value to them. For instance, like when we look into the stats relevant of what's occurred throughout 2020, we can see that in April, it stated that there was 26 million jobs that were lost in the US. 40% of US residents reported feelings of anxiety. 29% felt depression. We can see that people looking for divorce was 34% higher from March through to June. So I think just an important thing for the listeners is to make them aware that they're not alone and they're not experiencing this trouble by themselves, and that most likely people around you will be thinking and feeling the exact same. So when we look into things like the suicide rates here and the depression, which is going up, and a lot of this information isn't being reported by the news and the mainstream media. For instance, there's just one firefighter in Melbourne which passed on information which said that he was going to suicide 1 in every 3 days, and that was just one fireman, and that was just the district what he was covering in Melbourne. So you can really see how much suicide has gone up. So I would like to just make people aware that if you are struggling and if you are finding it difficult, please communicate, please reach out, and please understand that there's a lot of information out there which can help people, which can support their mental health, their mental well-being, which may not be in mainstream knowledge, but can really support you on that journey. And if people need help, support, then they can always hit the email button on my Instagram page. Kat, my partner, she's hitting this, she's managing all that kind of stuff. So that's one reason why we're actually able to touch base effectively, because I'm quite hard to pin down. I actually don't have a mobile number.
Nice.
This is a different thing. But yeah, I just want people out there to understand that, I just want you to reach out. It can be to anyone, but reach out to a friend. And if you don't feel down, I think it'd be very valuable if you could reach out to a friend anyway, possibly one that you've not spoken to in a long time, just tell them how much you appreciate them. If you don't listen to anything in this podcast and you just listen to that little bit, you'll make my day, whoever's listening right now. So thank you.
Amazing. Yeah, I think the idea of, if you're doing well, reaching out to friends is important, because often I think we can struggle, I think, when we are struggling to reach out and ask for help. So actually, if we're in a position where we can reach out and ask if we can be of service, and that can be a really powerful tool and a ripple effect.
Exactly. And then when we look into things like depression as well, it's stated it's a disorder, but I personally see it as a symptom, because there's over 40 different reasons why someone may be experiencing depression. They could have seasonal affective disorder because they've been locked down in quarantine and they're not been getting sunlight, so they can't really support the serotonin pathways effectively with the presynaptic neuron. Or they could have poor sleep. They could be sensitive to electromagnetic frequencies. They could have nutrient deficiencies in vitamin B6. They could have an inflamed gut. They could have social isolation. They could have a lack of fulfillment in their job or their role or their career. There's many different things out there. So even if you are struggling and feeling depression, and however that may resemble to you, it could be different to the next. It's important to know that there is definitely an upstream reason as to why you're feeling that way, and there's answers for all of it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the diagnoses, the conditions, the labels we have are still a symptom ultimately. And as you said at the very beginning, the whole concept of functional medicine, going upstream and looking for the true cause or underlying imbalance that could be contributing to that symptom or that diagnosis, is just so important. Jake, I think we can close it off there. There's been so much information that you have shared with us on so many different topics that I think I feel like I need to re-listen to this conversation already.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah.
So, thank you so much. I know you're a busy man. So thank you for sparing a good hour and more to come and chat with me.
It's my pleasure. It really is.
And I was going to say, is there anything that you want to conclude with? But quite frankly, I think what you just said there is probably the best conclusion we can have to an episode at this point in time. So I think that's a perfect place for us to say thank you to everyone for listening, if you've got this far, hopefully. And thank you very much, Jake, for sparing the time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Alex.